Thank you for listening to the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service with me, Josephine McDermott. Today we're going back 28 years to a case which resonates to this day with Filipino people who work overseas. The execution of Filipina maid Flor Contemplacion in Singapore. Her death led to protests, a government resignation, and a diplomatic crisis between the Philippines and Singapore. Flor Contemplacion's daughter and lawyer recall that time. It's the 16th of March 1995, and Edra Alalia, a young lawyer, has one last chance to save a woman's life. Flor Contemplacion is scheduled to be executed for murder the next day. Edra has flown out to Singapore with a woman called Virginia from the Philippines. She says she can testify that her friend is innocent, that she was forced to confess. They arrive at the gates of Changi Prison.
The walls were high, and there were steel bars, and there were guards, and there were a lot of media, both Filipino and foreign correspondents, milling by the gate because they knew that there was a countdown to the execution. It was eerie. You can feel and smell that something was not right, even morbid, no? It was a busy area, but you can hear a pin drop because nobody knew how to react. Knowing that on the other end of the gate, there's this Filipina who's counting the hours before she's going to be hanged. And she's alone.
But then, the Singaporean authorities refused to allow the last-minute submission from Virginia.
Virginia was wailing at the gates. She was wailing. She was saying, Mama Flor, inocente si Mama Flor. In English, it said, Mother Flor is innocent.
And that was the feeling of millions of Filipinos. In 1991 in Singapore, a Filipina nanny called Delia Maga and the 4-year-old boy she looked after were found dead. The boy, Nicholas Huang, who had epilepsy, appeared to have drowned in the bathroom, and Delia had been strangled. Flor, who was a friend of Delia's, was arrested. By the time Edra came to the case the Monday before her execution, Flor had been found guilty after 2 appeals. The question, was she a guilty woman deprived of fair trial, or an innocent woman unforgivably let down by her home country?
Flor was supposed to have strangled Delia Maga in the flat of the employer of Delia Maga. So how come there were no fingerprints in the doorknob, in the closet, in the luggage, and that were presented?
No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, poor legal advice. Flor was advised to admit she was guilty, and there were accusations she was framed and threatened into confessing. She told her daughter Russell, who was 17 at the time, how she had struggled to get the help she needed.
Before ng hearing niya, she wrote a letter
1 week
to
before her
Philippine
hearing,
Embassy
she wrote a
staff.
letter to the Philippine Embassy staff, asking for help to get advice on what she would do. And then she told them the date and time of her hearing. But she did not receive any assistance from the Philippine Embassy in Singapore. Sometimes, the staff would even arrive after the hearing had ended.
Like many Filipinos, Flor had left her 4 children behind to work abroad. They flew to Singapore 2 weeks before the execution.
When her children came to see her, the best that they were able to do was to touch her hand with a glass window separating them. They couldn't even hug and touch and kiss each other for the last time. And then they were given only a few minutes before they were escorted out.
After this goodbye, the next time they would see their mother was when her body was returned to her home country.
Actually, Wednesday po.
Wednesday was our last visit because she did not want us to stay until the 17th.
Umuwi na kayo na Pilipinas. Mauna na kayo, doon yun na lang ako antayin.
She told us to go home to the Philippines. She said, "You go ahead, wait for me there, hug me there." The time that was not given to us, the chance to embrace each other. When I go home, let me feel your love and hug me tight.
On the morning of Thursday the 17th of March, Flor was hanged.
We knew the time of the scheduled execution, so we just waited. And then there was a call that confirmed. We were huddled together in one small room. I was holding hands with some Filipino reporters praying up to the last minute. And then when the call came in, of course, that was it, of course.
The next day, Edra found himself on the same flight as Flore's coffin back to the Philippines.
Your client is below your feet in a wooden box rather than her sitting beside you. We waited outside the airport when the body was transferred to a wooden flatbed. We followed the hearse all the way to the province, San Pablo, Laguna. I think that was 2 or 3 hours drive. And you can see both sides of the street and even the above ground walkways teeming with people. Of course, there was a lot of grief because you know why? It could have been my mother in that flatbed. Every single Filipino identified with Flor because every single Filipino has a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a cousin, a classmate, a neighbor who is abroad out of compulsion rather than out of choice. So when your government who sends you by force of circumstance abroad because they cannot provide their own sources of employment, and then you just lead them the way they did to Flor, then that is inevitably going to result in this kind of rage.
And there was rage. Singaporean flags were burned. People like this protester were at boiling point.
This is an expression of indignation by the entire Filipino nation for the injustices committed by the Singaporean government.
Alongside a growing political crisis, a family was grieving.
March 18 ng afternoon.
On March 18 at 3 p.m., Mama's body was brought to us in Laguna.
Nang kapi ni Mama talagang niyakap ko po talaga siya kasi yun po yung
As soon as they opened Mama's coffin, I hugged her because that was a promise we made to each other since we couldn't hug her or even touch her during our 2 weeks visit to her.
pagbisita sa kanya.
The pain and anger continued. The Philippines and Singapore both recalled their ambassadors. All this was happening in the run-up to national elections on the 8th of May, putting great pressure on President Fidel Ramos. He sent flowers to the family. The family sent them back. On the 20th of March, while Flor's body was laid out ahead of her funeral, he announced an inquiry. More than 40,000 people lined the streets for Flor's funeral a week later.
On the way to the cemetery, you can see the people along the way. They were waiting. I was surprised because it was the first time for me to see something like that. I thought that could only happen in movies.
Siyempre, una po yung
Soon after, the Presidential Commission announced its findings, that the evidence for Flor's conviction had been unreliable.
The only basis of the conviction and hanging of Flor Contemplacion is her confession, and there are a few witnesses who testified that it was not taken voluntarily. In other words, there are doubts that are raised. I'm not saying that we are sure that she's not guilty. We only said the evidence tries to show that probably she is innocent.
A week later, the Philippines Foreign Minister resigned.
With my departure, I hope that the partisan politics surrounding the Contemplacion case will subside.
Fidel Ramos went on to win the election. In the years to come, an independent panel made a ruling on the cause of Delia Maga's death, something the two governments had disagreed on. The Philippines accepted this, that she was killed by being strangled, and eventually the countries reconciled. Singapore had always stood by the conviction. How do you think involvement in the case changed you?
As a lawyer, it hit me, of course. I mean, why? Because I thought that being a lawyer, I could do more. But it turns out that you can only do so much. There was some depressing moments, no? To be frank with you, and even self-blame. But you translate that into something positive. What are you going to do not to make this happen again? And then eclipse all fleeting moments of disappointment and frustration, of helplessness that we were not able to bring home Flor alive with us.
I asked Russell if she or her children would work abroad.
time po talaga na parang down na
Even
ako
if
sa
life is
sobrang-
hard in the Philippines, it is better to be together and for the family to be whole.
Tas sabi ko,
Edra Alalia continues to fight for Filipinos on death row. Russell Contemplacion now works in the Filipino Congress and is studying to complete her degree, a promise to her mother. They were talking to me, Josephine McDermott, for that edition of Witness History.